Among the larger-than-life leaders of the Second World War, there is always one that has left out of the discussion, who chose not to side with the Allies or the Axis, but to steward his nation through the crucible, making great sacrifices to lead his people through to a time of greater prosperity. Franco. But to understand the man, we have to go back a bit and start with the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War is often referred to by postmodern historians as the dress rehearsal for the Second World War, citing their clash of ideologies. This is a pretty incorrect view, but one I would expect from Reddit-brained midwits. Spain in the 1930s was a country marked by economic distress, social unrest, and political instability. Following the collapse of the monarchy in 1931 and the establishment of the Second Republic, the Republicans were sowing chaos across the country with their sheer incompetence, really. Trying to introduce and then repealing reforms, trying to redistribute land, secularize everything in an extremely Catholic country. These efforts were inconsistent and provoked widespread opposition. This was further accelerated when in 1936, the election victory of the Popular Front, which was a coalition of socialists, straight-up communists, anarchists, and atheists, intensified further divisions. These different groups had built a coalition for a common aim, but they just couldn't work together. They all had their own autistic version of what Marxism and atheism should be. This led to widespread violence, attacks on religious organizations, the burning of churches, cathedrals, the assaulting of nuns, political assassinations, creating an environment of total disorder. In response to all of this, on July 1936, leaders in the Spanish military initiated a revolt, forming the nationalist faction to restore order and traditional values. So setting the stage, you have the Republicans, which are a coalition of a bunch of different types of Marxists being supplied by the Soviet Union. Then you have the nationalist faction, which are kind of the old guard, many of them monarchists, Catholics, and they're nationalists because they want to kind of restore the country, but not quite in the same way it was, teetering on the abyss prior to the revolution, right? The nationalist position was solidified by the need to counteract the Republic's descent into extremism. The Republican side, which was heavily run by Soviet advisors and international communist elements, engaged in a lot of repressive actions, including the execution of priests and the collectivization of property, which alienated large segments of the population, especially the poor who hated this, being forced onto collective farms like in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union itself had been directly acting against Spain since the mid-1920s and was a large part in overthrowing the monarchy with funding, covert agents, and direct actions, all in an attempt to expand the revolution to the rest of Europe and then the rest of the globe. The nationalists were comprised of monarchists, conservatives, and phalangists. The phalangists were a group that is basically Spanish nationalists, third positionists, Spanish Juche, you might consider it. But they sought to defend Spain's Catholic heritage and the pre-revolution society against what they viewed as foreign-imposed radicalism and communist elements. They didn't want to be a cat's paw of the Soviets. They wanted to be sovereign. Their military campaign, supported by disciplined forces and strategic alliances with Germany, Italy, and France, contrasted with the Republicans' internal conflicts and reliance on Soviet aid. By 1939, the nationalist victory ended the war, averting a potential communist stronghold in Western Europe and establishing a foundation for normalcy going forward. Coming to the man of the hour, Francisco Franco Bahamonde, or Big Frank, as his friends called him, emerged as the central figure in this victory. He was born on December 4th, 1892, in Ferrol, Galicia, to a naval family. Franco pursued a military career from an early age. He entered the Infantry Academy in Toledo in 1907 and graduated in 1910. His service in Morocco during the Rif War from 1912 owned his skills in colonial warfare, where he rose through the ranks due to his tactical acumen and leadership. By 1926, at age 33, he became Spain's youngest general. Under the Republic, Franco's conservative views led to periods of marginalization, but his role in suppressing the 1934 Asturias uprising elevated his status amongst the other nationalist right-wing elements. When the Civil War began proper, Franco had command of forces in Morocco, and he executed a successful airlift to the mainland and positioned himself as a key leader. By October 1936, he was appointed Generalissimo and head of state, and was able to consolidate control over the nationalist side in this civil war. Now, Franco himself, his ideology and policy combined disparate elements of the various right-wing factions in Spain. The Phalangists, the super staunch traditional Catholics, the nationalists, the populists. All these elements emphasized unity, tradition, and anti-communism. Franco himself really embodied the immune response in the body of Spain that was burning out the fever, or was the fever that was burning out the infection of communism and anarchy. His regime established a one-party state under the Falange Española Tradicionalista y de Lyons, which integrated various right-wing groups and synthesized them. His policies focused on centralization, with repression of dissent through tribunals and manual labor for some of the farms that were messed up. However, the core of Franco's governance lay in his economic strategies, which evolved from initial isolation to further expansion, ultimately contributing to Spain's recovery and growth. There are often a lot of parallels drawn between Spain and Chile about how they had their own little civil wars where the communists try to take over and a general restores order, and then he rules that country for a couple decades, restores the economy, and then there's a tradition back to a more traditional way of life, the sort of immune response. Such as Pinochet in Chile. Franco is kind of like Pinochet came a little bit after Franco, but you can kind of see the similarities there, right? In the immediate post-war period, Franco pursued autarky, a policy of economic self-sufficiency, inspired by fascist models but adapted to Spain's particular circumstances. This approach stemmed from the war's devastation. Agricultural output had fallen by over 20%, industrial production by 30%, and the regime's ideological aversion to foreign dependence on having to import things from other countries and then be susceptible to the influence from that. The Institut Nacional de Industria, established in 1941, oversaw state-directed industrialization, funding projects in steel, energy, and transportation. Agricultural policies emphasized import substitution with quotas on wheat and subsidies for domestic production. The 1941 law on new industries restricted foreign investment, aiming to build a resilient economy that was insulated from global fluctuations and instability. Now, this is a very interesting thing because a lot of the nationalist countries around this time tried to do something similar, but they all failed, right? Whether they were, getting involved in the Second World War, or they were cat's paws of the Soviet Union, or they were like many of the Allied powers who had these big overseas empires. Spain was the only one that really, and Spain did have a bit of territory in North Africa, right, in Morocco and in Macaba and stuff like that. But they were really the only country that didn't have these ties to other countries that were so intense in that way. They were outside the central banking system, and they went to great lengths to remain independent and self-sufficient. And a lot of this stuff, all the policies Franco does early on are about growing their own food, producing their own materials, being able to, run the country and grow without being reliant upon foreign credit or foreign resources. However, autarky's implementation did reveal some significant shortcomings, right? Rationing persisted into the 1950s, leading to widespread malnutrition and a black market that accounted for a lot of economic activity. Inflation did soar during the post war period. Well, not post war, this is during the war, but Spain wasn't a part of it. That's just a bit of a misnomer on my part, I suppose. But Spain, because of this, because of not taking part in the Second World War, was isolated from the Marshall Plan. That's the plan by the victorious United States to help rebuild Europe and give them a lot of funding. Spain was excluded from this because they decided to not take part in the Second World War and just focus on themselves. So kind of a dick move on the part of America. By 1950, per capita income was only about 50% of the Western European average. And immigration to Latin America and Europe did brain drain some of the workforce. The critics within the regime highlighted the autarky's insufficiencies, such as overinvestment in unprofitable heavy industry and some neglect of consumer goods. So, like, it wasn't a miracle. It wasn't all perfect. It didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of draconian policies to try and get things running, and it's because of early globalization. It was very hard to do all that. There was a lot of rationing. You couldn't just go to the supermarket and buy a million things because this wasn't a fully capitalist system. That was kind of the whole point, right? Is not to be dependent on the global markets and corporations running stuff. The idea was for autarky, and Franco's vision was that the government was working for the benefit of the people, but they were being shut off from the Marshall Plan and that all that aid. They weren't aligned with the Soviets either, so they didn't get any Soviet resources. They weren't invested in any kind of collectivized Marxist thing that brainwashed people to never complain. So there was a lot of critique, and that was allowed because of the freedoms. But self-sufficiency is tough, and eventually they were able to get to a point where it was possible, but there was some economic shrinkage in that period. Franco's response to all this demonstrated a lot of pragmatic flexibility. Franco was not an ideologue. He wasn't married to the idea of the third position. He just kind of picked and chose parts from it that worked for Spain. It's funny in China, right? The CCP, the Communist Party, the line is always communism with Chinese characteristics, right? Which is to mean that like China really isn't communist at all. They're extremely market driven in that regard, but it's really the idea is that Chinese communism is just capitalism, right? So it's kind of like that. Spanish fascism is really just like a bit of it's capitalism without globalist markets. It's very interesting. The 1953 Concordat with the Vatican and military base agreements with the United States marked a shift, which did provide some economic relief through aid and investment. The pivotal change came with the 1958 Stabilization Plan, orchestrated by Opus Dei and Alberto Ullastres and Mariano Navarro Rubio. This plan devaluated the peseta, which is the currency, by 30%. It liberalized trade by reducing tariffs and encouraged foreign direct investment through tax incentives. It also froze wages temporarily to curb inflation and balance the budget by cutting some subsidies. So basically, after Spain had stabilized and began to have more economic growth and prosperity, they said, okay, well, we're going to start, trading with some countries we like, such as the Vatican and the U.S. and some other places. We're not going to allow them to own large swaths of land or own huge corporations, but we can trade some resources on a tete-a-tete basis and start opening that up once the intense crisis had kind of been gotten past. The stabilization plan's success initiated the often referred to Spanish miracle. a period of rapid growth from 1959 to 1973. Annual GDP expansion averaged 7.1%, which outpaced all other European nations during this period. The industrial output tripled, especially sectors like automotive industry and chemicals. Tourism itself exploded, rising from 6 million visitors in 1960 to 34 million by 1973. Madrid's population doubled, infrastructure boomed, a couple trade deals with Germany produced a lot of output, and real wages rose significantly. These policies' effectiveness is pretty evident in some of the social indicators as well. Life expectancy rose greatly. Literacy rates climbed up to 93%, one of the highest in Europe around this time. I think in 75, literacy in the U.S. was around 70%, 72, 73. And that's average. Obviously, there's some issues with different parts of the country, but this is all great, but there were still challenges, right? There were some regional disparities. In Spain, you have like the Basque region and some of these other places where there's a bit of a sort of ethnic conflict. Andalusia, Catalonia. These places have always been problems, which isn't really like a Franco or fascism thing. That's just a Spain thing because of the way Castile and Aragon and Leon formed and all. Anyway, that's kind of beside the point. But on November 20th, 1975, Francisco Franco died at age 82. However, he had planned for this and set this up. In accordance with his 1947 law of succession, he restored Juan Carlos as King of Spain, initiating a planned restoration of the monarchy and divine right in the Catholic country. Franco had designated Juan Carlos as his successor in 1969, expecting continuity. But the king appointed some reformers, some more liberal thinkers like Adolfo Suarez, who legalized legal parties and drafted the new constitution. And this eventually, after a few years, sort of morphed into a constitutional monarchy that is still around today. Franco's economic policies ultimately succeeded in modernizing Spain, lifting it from a post-war ruin to a very developed and flourishing country. This transformation provided the stability necessary for the transition back from a total war state, underscoring Franco's really pragmatic evolution in terms of that. Spain is a very interesting look into the life cycle of a nationalist state that was able to survive the events of the Second World War. From the harsh measures taken during a time of war, to forging an independent economy not shackled to central banking, to an eventual restoration of traditional monarchy after the Great Crisis has passed and the immune response was no longer necessary. I know this is kind of a short video, it's succinct, but it's a topic that's always been really interesting to me. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If the third position stuff is very interesting as well, I'd be really interested to hear in the comments what you guys think about that. Is the third position just a mix of capitalism and socialist policies? Is it truly original? Stuff like that, which is really interesting to me. But anyway, that's it for today, guys. I hope you liked the video, and I'll see you later.